Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Welcome. My name is Tamara Stewart. I'm the Assistant Director of the Mount Vernon Public Library. Welcome to our Grace Green Baker Community Room. Tonight is a special night because tonight's program marks the one-year anniversary of our Decypher series of programs. This successful series is a collaborative effort between Rise Up, Black Westchester, and the Mount Vernon Public Library. Now, Decypher has brought us authors and artists to the library to discuss a wide range of topics with the goal of educating and enlightening the community. That being said, I will hand you over to someone who is a very skilled interviewer as well as being a community treasure, Dr. Robert Baskerville, aka Dr. Buck.
So thank you for your very generous introduction. Again, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's monthly Decypher variety show. As Tamara already indicated, Decypher is a variety show that's designed to spark discussion and engagement about the important issues that are confronting African Americans and other people across the nation and across the globe. I think the tenor of the times has filled many of us with fear and concern about the future of the nation, and we have been very fortunate to have a number of insightful guests to join us on stage to share with us their views about where we're at and what is to be done. To the classic question. Tonight, it's an immense pleasure for us to have on stage Dr. Catherine Liu. Dr. Liu is a professor of English, Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is the author of numerous books, several books. Most recently, the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, focusing our attention on, Virtue Hoarders, the case against the Professional Managerial Class. Increasingly, there has been concern about the spectacle that often takes place on a nightly basis in our national media and the role that media personalities play and the perhaps exploitation of many delicate issues, often not in the interest of the community and nation as a whole. And so it's an immense pleasure to have Professor Liu come and speak with us this evening. To begin with, Professor Liu is going to start out with a biographical statement, sure, but which is especially appropriate since she is from Mount Vernon, and we would like to hear more about that connection. So everyone, please join me to welcome Catherine Liu.
Thanks so much to Robert, Tamara, Mount Vernon Public Library, and Jeff for having me. This is a personal, conceptual, historical statement, and so what I called it is the political makes the personal. So I'm going to make an argument that goes against the grain of the cliche, the personal is the political. This phrase came out of 1960s-style consciousness-raising groups where upper middle class, mostly white women, talked about their personal experiences and then came to a click where they realized that their personal troubles were actually political problems. They became feminists when they realized that the discomfort and the uneasiness they experienced in their everyday lives was actually shaped by sexism and patriarchy. I'm going to go opposite. I'm going to argue the opposite of the personal is the political. I'm going to say the political makes the personal. Bear with me a little bit because the story I'm going to tell involves post-World War II American history, the Mount Vernon Public Library, and the story of my family's immigration to the United States. Oh my God, I'm going to cry. And my political and cultural formation. I told Jeff I'm going to cry. Okay. Despite the violence and the political troubles of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the optimism about building a better collective future for all Americans was still propelled by the post-war prosperity that distinguished 1945 to 1972 as an economic period. Unrest, social and cultural and political, seemed to point the way toward an expansion of democracy and democratic culture, an expansion of the emancipatory powers of pleasure in destroying authoritarianism and tyranny. My experience of that optimism can be identified with two factors. In 1969, my father was able to, on one salary, buy a house in Mount Vernon and support a family of 3, plus my grandmother, with a white-collar job that he had just gotten in 1967. All the arts and music education at Pennington Elementary School was free and began in the 2nd grade. There was no charge for instrument rentals or lessons. There was a dedicated music room with a dedicated full-time music teacher. I had no musical talent, but many of my classmates did. Many of them were Afro-Caribbean, and their parents were as strict as mine. Mount Vernon in 1969 was a multiracial, working to middle-class town. Pennington was our local elementary school, built and endowed by the Works Progress Administration, funded during the Great Depression when 40% of Americans were suffering from malnutrition. These craftsmen made the mosaics that tiled the drinking fountains of my school and the Gothic windows in the library. I am probably the last generation of Americans to have had a visceral experience of public generosity in public education. The physical discipline of austerity and budget cuts were just around the corner, but to 6-year-old me and my family, the idea of a public school free to all residents of a city was a minor miracle. High expectations for our future was the order of the day. Let's contrast the situation of my immigrant family with my present-day family today. We have 2 professional salaries to afford a home and a middle-class life, upper middle-class life. We raised 1 son who's here. Every arts and extracurricular program in prosperous Orange County must be paid for out of pocket by parents. There is no dedicated music room in my son's elementary school. I should say there was. He's obviously not in elementary school anymore. The music teacher drives between at least 2 different public schools to teach in 2 different programs. Wealthy parents are constantly fundraising for arts and music education. Instrument rental is expensive. Private lessons are expensive. The average value of a single-family home in our area has surpassed $1 million. Public austerity and private luxury are the order of the day. But when we moved to Mount Vernon, we had public luxury. Competition today for scarce resources is the order of our day. Public austerity and private luxury dominate our life worlds. But in 1969, the future that was projected was a very different one. And I insist that the future did not have to be this way. The political and economic outcomes that we confront are the result of history. And history is made by human beings, by class struggle. The American working class had won important gains by the 1970s, and even though my immigrant parents would have never thought of themselves as its beneficiaries, they were. From 1945 to 1973, the U.S. economy saw a dramatic transfer of wealth from the top to the bottom of earners. Fear of Soviet takeover, the U.S. domination of industrial production, coupled with massive worker unrest, saw an anxious elite make important concessions to working-class people. Many of these concessions took place as large infrastructural projects, for instance, the building of the federal highway system. My parents came from a feudal, Confucian, and authoritarian culture, and were completely unschooled in the cultural practices of common goods or democracy. Mount Vernon Public Library, where we are today, outside of Pennington School, was one of the first American institutions my family had contact with. This contact with them was very confusing and terrifying for my brother and me. The idea that you could come into a place and borrow books without paying any money, take the books home, read them, and then return them by a certain date in order to be able to borrow more books was entirely foreign to my father, whose own family had refused to pay for his education. My father didn't do much with us on the weekends because he felt it was very patriarchal, he earned all the money, he didn't need to do anything with the family, but he did take us to the library at least once or twice in our lifetimes. Both library trips ended in disaster. I began to prefer the bookmobile that visited Pennington School once a month. So when I was 8 and my brother 6, my father took us to the library and we returned our books, and the librarian said they were overdue and charged us a nominal fine that Dad paid. He was furious. He refused to let us take out any more books, and when we got into the car to go home, he told us to go back into the library to apologize to the librarian. She was very confused. David and I walked into the library, apologized to this woman at the front desk, and another time, he thought like they were going to throw us in library jail. Another time, Dad brought us to the library on a national holiday when it was closed. He was furious at me for not knowing that the library was closed on that day and locked me out of the house when we got home. Yes, these were difficult times for me as a child, but I'm not telling you these stories to make you pity me. Much more important than my suffering was my familial confusion at the incredible generosity of a public lending library, completely foreign to my immigrant father, born into feudalism and authoritarianism and deprivation. The fine the library exacted on us was not adequate to my father's sense of our infraction. He wanted more punishment. But the library was always generous, never judgmental. I don't know how many books I took out of this library to feed my growing curiosity. I had no guidance at all about what to read. My parents never bought me books, so this library fed my insatiable intellectual hunger. I made sure from the 2 disastrous trips with my father that my mother took me to the library, and I went religiously to the bookmobile. It was parked near Pennington, so I could walk there on my own on the weekends or stay after school and linger in the diesel fumes looking for my next book. I took full advantage also of the Pennington Library, begging the school librarian to take down books I couldn't reach. I read everything I could get my hands on, even cereal boxes, like religiously. Dad ordered Reader's Digest books for home, and I read a lot of right-wing condensed novels, like The Scarlet Pimpernel and God knows what else. But I lived for the library and the freedom to browse its shelves. Authoritarians know that the enormous generosity of a public institution is a dangerous thing. I was very nervous around librarians because I thought they were always going to throw me in library jail, so I preferred to wander around unsupervised. There is the classic Chinese authoritarianism that my parents grew up with, shortages and humiliation for the poor and the working class. The Chinese revolutions of the 20th century were meant to overthrow the feudal authoritarianism that had punished the Chinese people for generations. At the turn of this last century, I'm like so old, at the turn of the last century, the Chinese average life expectancy was 30. A corrupt and ailing dynasty ruled over China. The 1911 revolution overthrew the emperor, but the poverty and the war that my father was born into in 1931 were destabilizing conditions that maintained fear in a hungry and impoverished peasantry. The 1949 Communist Revolution was another massive political upheaval, meant to transform the nature of social relations on a massive, hitherto unknown scale. But change comes painfully, and my siblings and I got a taste of the punishing world in which my father grew up. The democratic institutions to which we were introduced as children were built by American 20th century upheavals, the Great Depression, the Great Migration, the fear of the Soviet Union, the labor unrest of 1947 that led to the strengthening of workers' rights, and wages, the civil rights movement, the 1965 Civil Rights Amendment that abolished the immigration quota system that allowed for the massive amounts of Asian immigration into America. I often ask my students, so what do you think the top marginal tax rate was at the in 1961, at the beginning of Mad Men, when that television series was on? And they're like, 45%? 50%? I'm like, no. They're like, 80%? And I'm like, try higher. 90% was the top marginal tax rate, 61. But then what we have seen is a kind of neoliberal punishment. Punishment means deprivation. And then there's the new authoritarianism of the neoliberal age, inaugurated in the 1970s and under which we still live. Cutting the budgets of public programs to stimulate the economy became the official policy of the American government. It was a new authoritarianism overseen by educated elites. Public schools and public housing were allowed to decay. Public programs were destroyed. The future into which this authoritarianism delivered us all was about competition and domination, but cloaked in a velvet glove. It was also instituted in the name of the even playing field of free markets. I benefited from the public institutions that Mount Vernon nurtured. I heard George Clinton's flashlight playing from a neighbor's house. I saw girls jumping double dutch on the street. My classes at Pennington were made up of African American, Jewish, and Italian Americans, and a lot of Afro-Caribbeans, but who were also Jam Asian, like half Chinese. And I was often the sole Asian American kid anywhere. I learned to speak English fluently at Pennington. I was afraid of white people, but I loved my teachers. I walked with my borrowed violin to school every day from Claremont Avenue. Like many immigrant children, I lived a double life. I was one person at home and one person at school. My parents moved us to Edgemont in 1979, following white flight from Mount Vernon. The classes there were smaller and more white. The campus was more bucolic. But looking back at things now, my teachers were better at Mount Vernon High School. Yes, I was harassed in the hallway on my way to my honors classes. Yes, the honors classes were already segregated with fewer African American students than in the entire school. And yes, I was taught a terrible lesson by all the moves that my parents were making. They were used to being uprooted. They were living lives of displacement and exile. They continued to move us around thoughtlessly. That fateful uprooting, that terrible move away from the first place in America that I could call home, taught me a lesson in displacement and detachment. It prepared me for a life of wandering, a life of displacements and ruptures, a life that one is encouraged to live as a member of the professional managerial class. This is a Marxist concept, a controversial concept, but one that is very instructive to me to think about the class warfare that has been waged against the working class world and working class people with whom I lived. So, sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this theoretical concept and less about me with Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we were all moved by your poignant recollection of some of your early experiences and how, to borrow your phrase, the political helped to fashion you as a person. Before we enter into our discussion, I'd like to use my position, invoke my privilege as the host of tonight's event to extend a warm welcome to one of my lifelong mentors, Brother Abishai Ben Rubin. I was fortunate to have been mentored by Brother Abishai and many of the brothers and sisters who coalesced around some of the formations that he was a part of during the early 1970s, especially the CAG camp over at then Nathan Hale School, and I will share a brief vignette of one of our activities that will speak volumes to why I'm here today. Brother Abishai may not remember, but when I was in his group, the Shaka Zulu, we had African names for our groups. I eventually was selected to serve as the principal in the end of summer play. And I'll never forget the memorable lines that I was asked to recite. I see before me, speaking to my audience of young brothers and sisters, doctors, lawyers, teachers, principals, and it is because Abishai helped to implant that vision in me when I was a child and continued to support me across many challenges that those of you who know me well know what I'm alluding to. And even when I strayed from the path, Brother Abishai was there to guide me and to provide a light, and for that I am eternally grateful, and I wanted to take the opportunity to publicly acknowledge him. I know I speak on behalf of many brothers and sisters here in Mount Vernon in saying that we are indebted to you, Brother Abishai. So, Catherine, I think it's very evident from your moving portrayal of your early years here in Mount Vernon, the anguish that you and many other observers have experienced in watching the transformation of American society and the decline in the notion of the public good and community. And I wanted to start our discussion of the PMC by asking you straightforwardly, what is the particular role? Maybe we could define PMC for those who may not be familiar with the literature, if you will, but also why you have laid the blame for many of the problems that we have experienced in the contemporary United States at the feet of the professional managerial class.
Okay, no, those are two big problems. Let me start with the first, the definition, which is this is a class of credentialed elites who generally belong to professional organizations, like that are supposed to regulate its behavior. Like I'm supposed to belong to the Modern Languages Association, the Society for Media and Cinema, and they're supposed and a doctor belongs to the American Medical Association, lawyers belong to the Bar Association, and so we're supposed to be governed by rules that are not dominated by market forces. This was the origins of the professional organization in the beginning of the 20th century when the robber barons were really raping and pillaging the country, and a group of progressive reform-minded people who were educated said, we need to put a stop to this, we need to create more equality in the world, we need to have the evils of capitalism be softened by this emergent professional class that was going to serve the people, work on the side of the poor and the exploited. So what you have during this period of time is the beginning of social work, the beginning of tenure, all of these things that were, let's just say, like, let's look at the American Medical Association. Like in the 19th century, people were just selling snake oil. You know, any doctors could abuse the Hippocratic Oath. And with the AMA, you're supposed to be regulated now by education, by credentials, by best practices, by do no harm. The evolution of the AMA, as we've seen now, because of big capital and our oligarchical control of the pharmaceutical industry, is that the professional class, which used to be a reform-minded, public service class, in its ideals at least, has become a plaything of big pharma. We saw that with the opioid crisis. We see that today in the ways in which mental illness is diagnosed and treated through drugs. So it was born in the progressive era and has been steadily corrupted with the evolution of capitalism. But one of the things that is really important to note is that a lot of my ideas come from John and Barbara Ehrenreich's 1977 essay on the professional managerial class, which says that all the left liberal organizations are being dominated by this class of credentialed white-collar elites. And in the history of leftism and reform parties, this is a new event, because people who are leaders of the Labor Party, even leaders of the Democratic Party, when it was just machine-driven, were coming out of cities, coming out of urban centers, coming out of unions, and now we have the situation where you have these credentialed elites who are monopolizing reform and progress or progressive politics in the United States. So in 1900, white-collar elites made up 3% of the American workforce. Today, they make up 25% of the American workforce. I like to think of them as a spear-tip working-class aristocracy. They don't own capital, but they're paid very well by capitalists to discipline workers below them.
So the role of what we today refer as the PMC has long been an object of reflection and analysis with a variety of assessments about its historical role in the transition to, let us be frank, socialism. A more positive assessment was offered by Karl Marx, and for those of you who know your Marx, maybe one of y'all will remind me verbatim of the quote where Marx talks about the tendency of at least a segment of the middle class, the intelligentsia, to side with the working class in its struggles against capital. And I also am a serious student of the new class, as I like to call it, the black new class. I am reminded of the pivotal role that the new educated black middle class played in the post-Reconstruction period in the face of a rising tide of white supremacy, where they formed colored women's clubs that did a lot of, to use the term of the time, that did a lot of the social work, formed important newspapers. Probably one of the most memorable examples would be the investigative reporting that Ida B. Wells did to uncover the true causes of lynching as part of her fight against disinformation that spread all across the nation at the time. And also the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a member of a number of these formations, including the Niagara Movement and then the NAACP. I mentioned Du Bois because Du Bois is famous for his talented 10th essay, where he sort of identified this new black class as critical to the struggle against white supremacy. And, he has come in for a lot of criticism that has grown increasingly strident since that time.
Right.
And so I must say that in reading your book, I was troubled. Because it is a searing indictment of the abandonment of the cause of the working class on the one hand, but on the other hand, I'm concerned that we may begin to sort of dismiss the important role that knowledge in potential plays.
No, knowledge is really, really important. And this is what, and knowledge should be mobilized for the cause of massive social change. But this class, and the way it's evolved, wants to monopolize knowledge, put it behind walls. And there can be no working class. I'm not like a know-nothing populist, although, it could seem that way sometimes. But the idea is that there can be no transformation of the social whole without a fully educated working class. But when you have education hidden away, monopolized behind the walls of universities, when you have a collapse of public education, when you have education become a luxury good, this is the situation that we're in. Within every left movement, successful and failed, you have an important role that people named cadres played. In the Chinese Communist Party, in the Soviet Union as well, you have to mobilize the intelligentsia. I mean, the Stalin-Cho trials were a terrifying situation, the Chinese Cultural Revolution were a terrifying situation, but I think to bring it home to the United States, what the Ehrenreichs were identifying in the post-68 period was a breakaway of this intelligentsia which had its own interests and were transforming its own interests to benefit itself. And were able to turn progressive politics into cultural practices. You know who's written a great book on the transformation of the African American leadership of the civil rights movement into professional activists is Cedric Johnson's From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders. Mm-hmm. Like in the 60s, there were people who acted as revolutionaries, and by the 70s and 80s, there was a whole cadre of African American elites. Today, elites of all different races who act as spokespeople for their class, who participate in the diversification of the elites that leads to no transformation of the actual social infrastructure of what we see today. I mean, in a way, I'm arguing for very basic bread and butter things like fully funded public higher education, refund all the public institutions that have been neglected for so long. I know that these things don't happen without struggle. But first, we have to remind ourselves of what we were capable of when we thought in collective terms. Like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, electrified the South. It wouldn't have been possible without engineers, without professionals. There's no way I'm arguing for let's return to the land and grow our own food and become communards. I'm not into that at all. I think we need educated elites to be on the side of the working class, to be on the side of large infrastructural transformations.
So, Catherine, in the book, you don't delve that deeply. It is a polemic, as you say, to put the fight out there and to raise the questions, but you don't delve very deeply into the structural transformation that has occurred, I'll say, in the media system here in the United States. We could use the public sphere if we wanted to. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know what were some of the main developments, transformations in the public sphere, in our media system that has allowed our intellectual class, managerial class to increasingly distance itself from the plight and the struggles of everyday people. There have been many. Mm-hmm. For me, the person that comes to mind is Russell Jacoby. Mm-hmm. I'd like to say Jacoby. But
Jacoby. It is Jacoby.
Okay.
Jacoby. Yeah.
In his
The Last
Intellectuals, where he talks about some of the underlying causes. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to identify some of those causes and maybe also how emerging technologies, though maybe not used to the advantage of working class people by the dominant PMC today, whether you think it holds out any potential.
Social. Okay, so let's. I don't know which arguments you're talking about in Jacoby, but I did read his book with a lot of interest. One of the things that happened was local media was just destroyed by media consolidation. So when I was growing up in Mount Vernon, there was a local paper that then became absorbed by Gannett. It was the Daily Argus, right?
Yes. We remember, I delivered newspapers. I was just telling my son.
You know what? I'd like to go to the archives. I've always meant to go to the archives because I think I had my first publication in the Daily Argus. It was after the '77 blackout. And these neighbors came and delivered candles to our house because my parents were just not prepared for it. And I wrote like a thing about, like very nice, like very florid, like overwritten, like, "Dear Daily Argus, new community does work." The lights went out, and a neighbor in our street came and delivered candles to every family. And, I lived on a, street that was African American, Jewish, and us. And, it was just like a really, like I had this beautiful like rainbow, I probably cringe when I read it now, but I think that was my first publication because I wrote to the Daily Argus, like you should. But it just became absorbed by Gannett. Nobody's interested in covering local politics. People are, that kind of media consolidation has created a media environment where no real deep investigative journalism of local corruption can take place because no one supports it, there's not enough of an audience, and yet we have like social media. We're all ready to be in touch with 100 million people all over the world. And I think the breakup of the media monopolies is really necessary, and the professionalization of journalism. So before the 70s, you had cub reporters, and it was mostly men because it was very sexist, but who could work themselves up though from a newsroom and cover the beat. The classic story of the cub reporter is you get sent to cover a smoke-filled city council meeting, and then you work your way up into covering more events of national significance. By the 70s, when the Ehrenreichs are writing, more and more journalists have to go to journalism school. Journalism school is expensive. There are only a few that are credentialed prestigious, Columbia, Northwestern, etc. And you have a homogenization of those voices. So now even if you have women in those places and people of color, they all go through the same elite universities. Many of them come out with $300,000 worth of debt because it's a 3-year program, it's extremely expensive. So what do when you come out with $300,000 of debt and a master's in journalism? You say what the man wants you to say. You're like, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna go, to USA Today and cover like, so-and-so's latest liposuction. And so there's more and more trivia, more and more sensationalism, and the sort of media infrastructure is now built on these oligopolies that are trying to extract as much profit as possible from sensationalism. The internet has now destroyed even, print newspapers, but USA Today is like the trashiest newspaper in the world, but it's also like one of the most profitable. So the professionalization of journalism has not led to an improved journalistic environment because the political media economy has been transformed by monopolization, by professionalization. And I think that it's what did you called it, the public sphere, the media sphere, that is one of the most critical elements of failure in our democracy. And one of the things that Bernie Sanders wanted to do was have publicly funded local newspapers again. Like there should be a local newspaper publicly funded with local journalists covering local issues without having to account for clicks or advertising or things like that. And then politicians would be frightened of being, scrutinized by these watchdogs. This pillar of democracy is really failing and collapsing. I'm not saying there isn't good journalism that's taking place. Right. It's just that the political economy of journalism does not encourage the kinds of attention that we need to give to these different layers of local corruption and democratic politics. And you can't have democratic politics without excellent journalism. So I think it's really funny when America's like, oh yeah, we're for freedom, and we go into other countries like, we're for freedom. This is the most, I have never experienced like more unfreedom in the public sphere than now, actually, to tell you the truth, in this country. And I'm like, what a joke, right?
Right.
U.S. imperialism is also facilitated by the Professional Managerial Class. That's the other thing I was going to talk about. In terms of the Cold War, another U.S. imperialism, the rise of the CIA, the rise of the security state has also facilitated the rise of the professional managerial class. The think tanks, the security sponsored think tanks, all of these experts who from the 1950s modeled what would happen in nuclear war, those were incredibly empowered people from the 50s onward. They prosecuted the Cold War. And in 1989, they could say, like, we won. We helped America win.
Right. Your brief sketch of Cold War politics is sort of reminds me of, I guess a critique that I had of some of the explanation that I saw in the book about the change in the ethos of the PMC. I mean, it's impossible for us to talk about the abandonment of a true vigorous working class politics here in the United States, especially in the African American community, without talking about the Cold War purges that you've just alluded to, and the way in which not only the working class itself was disciplined, but also many of its most avid supporters in the PMC, in the intellectual formations that were much more candid in their denunciations of imperialism and American foreign policy, amongst others. I'm reminded here, of course, of the seizure of passports of many critical figures. Paul Robeson is one figure who comes to mind, who is denied his passport as a way of punishing him for his unvarnished support of the Soviet Union and the Soviet people. The similar kind of treatment that W.E.B. Du Bois was subject to, that eventually led to his self-exile in Ghana right before the civil rights movement really took off. Took off in a big way here in the United States. And so...
yeah, there was a concerted effort to persecute leftists in the United States that should not be underestimated. And this is related to a Mount Vernon story too. So and my father was not, I would say, a serious leftist, but he was a sympathizer with the communists after a certain point. But in '72, Nixon went to China, right?
Yes.
And that allowed people to get visas to go to China that winter. And my father had left in '49, and he hadn't seen his parents since that time. And so he was working at the UN, he managed to get a visa, and he went to China with my brother to see his parents and to show them his son, because that's the patriarchal thing to do. Like, look, Dad, I produced a son. And when we came home to Mount Vernon, we were visited by both the FBI and the CIA. My parents were terrified. My father had a notebook that from some souvenir trip to China that says the thoughts of Chairman Mao, and I borrowed it. I made him give it to me just now, and my mother was like, "Don't show that around everywhere. You should hide that in your bag," because it really, really frightened them. And they came and they knocked on our door. And they said to him, "Mr. Liu, do you have anything to tell us about your latest trip to China?" Whether it was intimidation or recruitment, I don't know, but those things really stuck with me. And I think that as, growing up in the 70s and then 80s, I think we cannot underestimate how terrifying it was to be, in graduate school and to say you had leftist sympathies. It was not really readily accepted, right? You could play with it a little bit. You'd be like, "Oh, I read some Marx," but to say I'm a Marxist or I'm a socialist, that was actually quite terrifying. I don't know if you had the same experience, but maybe because I internalized what happened in the 70s to my family, I felt like I always had to be in the closet, so to speak.
No, I'm fortunate to have been spared that kind of persecution, but I do know that the purges of the university were legion, and going not only back to the Red Scare, but also even to the upsurge of militant activity that took place here in the United States in the 19aughts and 19-teens, where you had progressives who were taking a much more adamant public stance in support of working class struggles only to find themselves stripped of job security and forced to toe the I'll say pro capitalist line of many board of trustees. I think those kind of purges occurred in Columbia, I think, involving some of the progressive economists.
At Columbia University?
Oh, for sure. In the 1920s, they
Oh, yeah.
one or two
Oh, in the
people
20s, yep.
got taken to task.
Yep.
But it's a pattern
Yeah.
that we've seen here in the United States, both in the university and in the media. And, you know, to cite a contemporary example that may not have the glamour, but I think is very instructive is, at least for my money, the newly hired CEO of CNN, drummed out their media critic, who many might find his media criticism to be rather milquetoast, Brian
I know what you're talking about.
Sosa, yeah. You know, and at least if you read some of the background reporting on it, it's precisely because the CEO thought that CNN was becoming too radical. Strangely enough, because I know one of the issues you want to sort of, you know, challenge the kind of faux radicalism, if
Right,
you will,
right.
that we often see on TV. But that is the stated rationale, and I think it does really highlight some of the ways in which the power of capital continues to exert itself and suppress critical discussion.
Yeah, and to demand a kind of ideological conformity. I was thinking of someone like more nerdy and long ago, but you know, C. Wright Mills was a left-wing sociologist at Columbia. They didn't fire him, but they marginalized his work, and people didn't read him in sociology. You came up in sociology. People didn't read him until more recently, and a lot of my work really owes a lot to his work, especially on white collar and the power elite. And he was really a dissident, and there's less and less room. I find, okay, on the one hand, there's more room to talk about socialism. There are many more socialist organs. But on the other hand, there's a lot more demand for liberal conformity on the side of the left.
Right. Yes, you want to-
Oh, yes, please.
I was waiting for you to follow more organically.
Oh, okay, yes, we should open it up to questions. Yes.
But just give me some
I was hoping Brother Jeff would.
two.
He's usually behind the camera, but
Yeah,
I
it's-
really
it's-
was hoping as I was driving.
And you
over
do an
Brother
excellent
Jeff.
job, Brother Rob. I just, it's hard playing tech and stage manager, whatever. But first of all, thank you, Catherine, for coming through. And thank you for all the community and guests for coming out. This is riveting, okay? In fact, I'm having a problem trying to find where to interrupt because you've passed over like 3 or 4 different
Sorry.
issues. No, don't apologize, because I want to first start with, you know, some of your experiences in your early experiences in Mount Vernon. I've been here for about 30 years as an organizer. Didn't grow up here, but I've seen as an African person and as an organizer and as an immigrated African to a country, a colonial entity in what they call Chocolate City, the fear, this very pervasive fear that you're talking about in terms of the state upon you know, the working class in general, but in particular African people or non-white people. So to hear of the state intervention, the CIA, FBI, police state intervention, it's very pervasive in Mount Vernon still, although you don't see jack-booted, uniforms running down the street. You have a fear. There's still a very pervasive fear in the media, and you're right, Gannett does not cover any real analysis. I remember the Argus. I mean, it wasn't, the Nation, but it was not by any means what the Gannett is now. And you don't have any local media that really deals with working class issues, even from a community. Now, you do have Black Westchester, which is one of our sponsors. We have some, kind of nascent efforts, but all is leading to a question. I want to know what you think we could possibly do better in organizational terms, in the streets, really getting to the people, because we're not going to do it with our elected leadership. They're part of the fear. Community media is something that Jonathan Michael Davis and we urgently want a public access system, and they're literally fighting that. It's one of the most basic technical media enterprises in the country is being fought in Mount Vernon. So I'm saying that community media is something that is not just, corporate enterprise, but as it's a way of life. How do you see young people and those of us as organizers using it better?
Community media.
Yeah.
I don't feel like it's my expertise at all, Jeff. I don't know if I can help you or with any of this, but I do really feel like one of the things that leftists often fail to do is to meet people where they are, to meet people with their needs. I really don't think we should be lecturing people and telling them about new, like, social identity categories, number one. Number two, and this is like really simple-minded of me, but it is my dream, I feel like we should have leftist sports leagues. So many young people need support. They need, and not just basketball, but just all sorts of sports. Like when I go and I see like how these upper middle class people like sponsor their kids in all these sports and how much money and time they invest in this, and I think about all the talent that's out there and all the parents who don't have enough time or energy to do that. What we as leftists should do is provide like meaningful leisure time. Like the media now is like infotainment, right? And TikTok just like takes all young people's attentions away from the political things that matter. But rather than lecturing at them, I feel like we should go back to like old school style of, the Black Panthers provided hot breakfast, but hot breakfast and a soccer game, or, hot breakfast and, basketball leagues, really organized and disciplined. I feel like that's what young people need. They don't need like this fake PMC tolerance or diversity training. I hate that shit. Like, we need to create like real leftist leisure time for working class people and kids. Like, that's my dream. That's my dream when I retire, is to start a socialist tennis academy and have it be free, And I just I see what it's like, how important it is to like have kids be seen. And so many working class families are struggling just to put put food on the table. And so we need to like give them the pleasures in life and not be like, hey man, here's capital, you should be doing this. I am so not into that kind of political education. Political education to meet people where they are and give them like a bit of joy that capital wants to take away from people and sell it back to you in these like prepackaged terms.
Yes. It's interesting that you should mention the need for these community institutions, Catherine.
That's what it is, yeah.
What I think is left unaddressed in your book, which...
A lot was left unaddressed, yeah.
Specifically because you are employing a Marxian framework and a lot of assumptions and tenets that are passed down from Marx. And it seems to me that, at least in my reading of your critique of the PMC, what is left unexplored is those within the Marxist tradition who try to move away from a kind of narrow focus on workplace politics, struggle on the factory floor, to expand it to include the need to develop, perhaps even capture, cultural institutions that were responsible for instilling in people the common sense. The Gramscian notion that this is all about why the revolution failed. That's what we're talking about now, and why the PMC in particular has failed to perform their historical role. Mm-hmm. And, the disappointments of the socialist revolutions of the 20th century caused many thinkers to go back and revisit some of those assumptions. And, to throw a name out, Gramsci, the Italian Marxist says, listen, we gotta wage that cultural battle. And it reminded me of something that I read in graduate school, The Cultural Front by the historian Michael Denning, where he really goes through in great detail, all of the kind of cultural organizations that the labor movement in particular, which was his main focus there, had created in order to create that sense of solidarity, including solidarity across racial lines. And so in that respect, I think your call to us to reconsider.
I mean, it's an uphill battle, right? Because the culture industry is so powerful. And we could have an internecine, like Marxist debate about
Right.
how I could be like, too much Gramsci, not enough
Right.
Lukács, nobody wants to hear that. But I feel like, yes, the cultural front is a front of struggle, but a lot of the PMC leftism has made cultural consumption its focus. I really think that one of the things that we should keep in mind at all times is that how do we convey to people, because the professional managerial class will not do this, the understanding that your interest as a worker is not the interest of your boss. The boss's interest is directly in contradiction to yours. So the cultural institutions are really important, but one thing I do try to show in the book is that the professional managerial class has internalized the values of capital so deeply that it doesn't even know who its boss is anymore. It thinks like you're the boss of yourself, you're managing yourself. Well, Marx says in, Capital that the political struggle is actually over the working day. Capital would like to work people until they die. Then they realize, okay, maybe that's not so efficient because then we have to replace the workers. So we have to give them enough to eat. We have to let them sleep a little bit because otherwise then workers are not reproducing themselves quickly enough. And I think that that's still the struggle today, but because of all of the comforts that the professional managerial class has gotten, like, in my profession, we forget that actually the boss's needs are completely contradictory to our own. And I feel like that's a lesson we need to keep in mind. And so when I talk about leisure time, I think it's like valuing working class leisure time so that you can say to people, look, this is your time. That the boss wants to take as much of your time away from you as possible. And so that has to be the bottom line for all of this. So I'm agreeing with you to a certain degree, but I feel like a lot of the cultural front struggles that I've seen in the past 40 years lose sight of the struggle for the working day and the need for human capacity to be realized as a universal struggle of the worker against the time of the capitalist.
Now,
the more you can experience joy, the more you feel like you need to protect it from the boss.
The subtitle, the main title is The Virtue Hoarders.
Yep.
And your principal thesis is that so much of the political discussion that takes place in the mainstream media is able to avoid the class question, questions of exploitation and inequality,
Right.
by focusing attention on the difference question,
Right.
the experience of disrespect that
That's right.
African Americans, other persons of color, and other sexualities, and we'll just say alternative lifestyles, are increasingly defended against in our mainstream media at the cost of a total neglect of the underlying issue that unites everyone. And in your judgment and in my judgment, I fully agree with you that our economic exploitation is what unites us all. But I did want to, having said that, I was troubled. And the reason why, Catherine, is because the emphasis on identity politics that has really begun to receive increased attention in the United States today is hardly new. Many would argue that ours is a system of racial capitalism in which categories of race are inseparable from the, overall position that people have in the, economic system and the degree of intensity of exploitation. And I think this is an important question because previous generations of black socialists took exception to the insistence on the part of the white working class, led by various socialist formations in the beginning of the 20th century, that you are to put class first. And there was a heated debate whether it was class first or race first that was actually engaged in by a number of committed black socialists who were fearful that should we simply institute socialism as it was understood at that time,
Which
that
time? Which time is this?
the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay.
Socialism as is understood in the United States during that time, that there was a danger that it would do very little to touch the system of white supremacy that did not simply live in the workshop, but also exercise monopoly over important centers of power outside of the workplace. We had here on the stage not too long ago Jeffrey Perry, who has written a 2-volume biography on the, I think, most forceful exponent of this position, which was the Black Socrates of Harlem, Hubert H. Harrison, a socialist who organized with the socialists of the time, but was so turned off that he had to let it go. Before we have a question, and I know I recognize my brother. And
Okay.
Like you said, this is vivid. What do you think presently is the predominant? Is it social racism or is it class? Which one is it? I know they operate together, but which one are we experiencing now in this common moment in time?
What, racism or classism?
Or classism, yes. Or is it are they working symbiotically?
They're working symbiotically, and I also don't think like it's an ism issue. Like that's already a liberal framing of it. I feel like class is a contradiction where the bosses are exploiting the workers, and I feel like the way of displacing all of this is to say I'm arguing for a kind of socialist universalism.
So you're just saying that classism is exploiting everybody, white, black, everybody, and then you're saying that that white America isn't astute enough to know that they're being exploited equally, or it's just only because of the use of the application of racism towards the African American community, because that's very real to us. That's something that many people, white America, does not have a clue about because it's designed as such. So what I'm saying is, how are you going to convey that to where it's understandable to the white American that they are being exploited equally at the same time that blacks are experiencing racism? I mean, it's an incredible conundrum. It's
So almost this like a is- paradox. But this is one of the things I will argue with, about when people bring this question up is, within every single racial category in America right now, the rate of economic polarization is similar. So it's like a curve like this where you have the top earners earning more exponentially than the bottom earners. The top 0.1% of African American wealth is accruing more and more wealth. The bottom 99.9% are getting less and less of the total African American assets. It's a similar curve for Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, white Americans. It's all assets accruing to the top 1%. And that is the thing that I want to emphasize. Inequality is actually being replicated statistically in a similar curve within every single racial category. So the Obamas are getting richer and richer. at the rate that Warren Buffett is getting richer and richer, and the working class white person is getting poorer and poorer, the working class African American person is getting poorer and poorer. Now there are like radical differences with regard to like urban planning and public health, right? And that is structural racism. And I think the best way to change that is to radically overhaul universal policies that will help African Americans the most within the most deprived communities. But to have that, but we all should be focusing on flattening the curve with regard to distribution of assets. Now, the African American communities have classically been really, really persecuted, especially in urban areas. And you can see the thing that I was talking about in the paper was the enormous comparative demographic industrial shifts that capitalism demands of workforces that should make African American struggles similar to other struggles. There's another enormous migration, which is from rural China to coastal China. The Chinese factory is chewing up Chinese people, Chinese workers, at an incredible rate. At the same rate that Detroit, Lockheed Martin, chewed up African American workers from the South. And these are things that we need to look at comparatively and create solidarity from. Not just like, oh, I'm going to stay in my lane and demand more from my people. This is what it means for me to be a socialist, to understand like the universal struggle for human emancipation. And I want to place that first and foremost. And what capital has done is stripped the poorest people of their potential for human realization. And it's happened, I wish someone would do this comparative study where you can look at the migration of Chinese peasants who are so poor, who are taken out of their rural environments, put in these factories along the coastal cities. This is what happened to African Americans in Chicago, in Detroit. Once in '72, they decided they were going to like export those cheap jobs to Asia. The tenements and the cities of the Midwest just collapsed, right? But it was from the force of those human laborers, industrial labor force that created the prosperity of the mid-century, and it's creating the same prosperity in China now, and it's going into the hands of like a couple of billionaires. And we should have socialist education that tells people like your struggle is my struggle. Not just like, I have my struggle. I'm telling you, African American PMCs are just the same as white PMCs. In every racial category, we have the same class divisions. We see the same kind of contempt for working class people. I don't think there's an organic like solidarity that one class feels or one race feels with regard to working class people. We are all equal opportunity offenders on this level. And the way to build a true like global working class struggle is to understand what capitalism needs and how it just takes the best of people and then just like throws them out when it doesn't need them anymore. And this is the other thing that I feel like I'm not writing about, but someone should write about this. I mean, someone will write about this someday. But like, my family came from Taiwan, which is a tropical island colonized by Japan, right? And I think one of the reasons I felt really comfortable in Mount Vernon was because a lot of my neighbors and friends were from Jamaica, which was an island colonized by England. And one of the things that we had in common was our parents were incredibly uptight. Because we're like always trying to be proper, like what are you doing wrong? You're violating something, like, and it's always like seeing yourself through the eyes of like a colonial occupier who's telling you you're not good enough. Right. And I feel like my best friends who were Jamaican Caribbean, they were really successful, but they were persecuted by American African Americans who said that they were like, being white. And so we were all alienated in this really intense way. And then my parents plucked me out and I was like in this like very wealthy suburb and I didn't know what I was doing. And then I got a scholarship and went to Yale and I like was really plucked out by my roots. But one thing that like kept me true to my roots in Mount Vernon was that I understood, like, unconsciously even, how my Afro-Jamaican friends and I were being like pressurized by all these different factors that had to do with racism, colonialism, immigration, our own internalized sense of like not being good enough, so we had to be perfect. And I feel like we need to find like ways that we share experiences. And to be perfectly honest, like I was constantly called the worst racial slurs by African American students in Mount Vernon High School. Like there's a lot of interracial conflict that happens too. I survived it, and it's like that. It didn't make me like be like, okay, they're all racist. No, like what did we actually have in common? What were the things that? How was I a part of this community? Of course, it didn't last very long because my parents pulled me out of it. But I had my racial education here in Mount Vernon, and it's really shaped who I am today.
Where do you live now?
I live in California.
And also, you came to visit back to the city of Mount Vernon?
Yep, my mother just turned 80. So Jeff was talking to me, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be in New York. And he's like, okay, come over. So it was just, yeah, that's what happened.
Brother Abishai, you have a question.
I'm so happy. I need to talk in the
Yes,
mic.
you must,
All
Brother
right.
Abishai.
Excuse me.
Jeff, behind you.
I really, 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 I'm so excited. I came through early when they were setting up, and I didn't know if I was going to make it back because I thought I had to cook for my wife. She's out doing some other things. And when I got back here and I seen and I listened to you, especially when you were up there and you were tearing, it is exactly what I was talking to Queen Mother Kathy about, this community meeting that we want to have. We want to have every segment of Mount Vernon, 4 square miles, meet us here, what we want to call a love fest, where we learn how to move from our heart, not just from our ego. Things have shifted in the world and cosmically. See, that's another thing. If you don't connect spirit, mind, and body, you just start dealing with mind and body. That's not our totality. So in this discussion, I'm very excited. You need to come back, beloved, whenever you can. Because your humanism outweighs the Marxism. I come through the Panther Erie. Now, I'm telling you, this is the real deal. If you want to know the real deal about how to organize a community, you got to do bonding rituals. Like you said, you got to meet people where they are. And if we had the campaigns that really were successful in Cuba, Mozambique, that was my thesis in college, was the revolution of Mozambique. And it wasn't for the women movement in Mozambique, they'd have failed. They wouldn't have won that revolution against the Portuguese. But the women have an inner connection to everything because we come through y'all. Men don't bring no children in the world. The women do. So there's a connection with the everlasting energy of love that we put aside for our politics. You see, I'm down for the Marxism. I come through all of that. Big time Panther. And one of the things that was successful that we need to utilize again is their organizing techniques. How to meet the people, how to have programs that exalt the people, make them feel they're loved and cared for, which is a natural thing everybody needs. Brother Bob, I love him so much. And now I'm seeing why they have you here. Because we really, really love you. You need to be back here, or you need to start cloning and... No. When I say that, you got to start mentorshiping. You got to find the ones that have the vibration that you got, beloved, and start mentoring them. Bring the young people around. Let them hang out. Why do you think they killed the brother in Chicago like that? Because he had every ethnic group organized. Fred Hampton. They identified that. They identified those who move like that. And you're right. The professional class kind of sold out. But Che Guevara and Castro jumped class.
That's right. They were bourgeois, and they were for the working class.
Right.
They gave the people their dignity. They sat with the people.
Absolutely. So you do the same thing, beloved.
I will come back. Okay, maybe this is where I start my socialist tennis club. My socialist tennis making club. My dream. Thank you. Thank you.
I have lots of comments, questions, everyone, but it is now 7:30, and we do want to open the discussion up to audience members. Y'all may have your own observations, comments, questions that you'd like to ask of Catherine, and if you do, please, by all means, feel free to ask away.
Are you selling a book?
I don't know. You know what? It's for free online on Manifold, so you can download it online. You can buy, I don't have any books with me, but
I will also tell you that it is available. It's a slim volume, and very affordable. I think it's
$10.
It's for $10 through Amazon or another online bookseller.
Yeah.
If
And
you
the library will have 3 copies in about 2 weeks.
Okay, great.
They're coming, we're gonna have them processed.
great. And then I'll take them out and forget to return them, and then go to library jail. Yeah, good.
I have to commend you because this is what the library should be about, offering educational venues that truly inspire. You're inspiring. And that was, I first only wanted to stay a little while because but I couldn't leave after I started listening to your discourse. And thank you so much for interacting with her, because you actually gave her the platform or the intellect, the intellectual battering back and forth in order to inspire. What we really need at this particular point is some method to get what we've just experienced in this small collective out to just a few more people so it can get momentum. I find when we try and do it too much at one time, we get so much pushback. But if you can incrementally just get a few young people exposed to just the philosophy, because a lot of people right now, it's almost radical only because we don't know anything else. All we know is purchasing and competition against one another. Right. And that's what I find that, and I'm so happy to see just my white brothers and sisters over there in the corner. I was impressed to see that somebody else was coming in Kenya. And if nothing else, that visual effect should be made available so it could be seen that blacks and whites both were entertained by an Asian American that was raised in Mount Vernon and has come back to the city. I mean, because Mount Vernon is such an extraordinary municipality. Everything comes and comes from Mount Vernon, but often it doesn't come back the way you have come back to share your experiences. So this is profound, and I just greatly thank you for this
so
opportunity.
welcome. You're so welcome.
Thank the two of you.
Yeah, well, I'll be in touch with all of you, all of y'all. I'll come back and do public. Yeah, I will. We need more public education that isn't like lecturing at people. You know, kids at school are so oppressed right now. Part of schooling is so much about competition and like getting a job and job training. We need to show them the joyful parts of education, the emancipatory parts of education. And that's why I really don't like, I mean, I teach as a professor all the time, but I'm just like so, if you don't mind I'm so fucking sick of people lecturing me, of this kind of pedantic, like, I know better than you, and I'm going to tell you this. You know, one of the things I realize is like the PMC blocks like our commonsensical knowledge of what it is to be exploited, what it is to be humiliated at work. And what people know what that is. It's just that there's a lot of like fancy pants language about like, I'm managing myself for productivity. That's BS. Or my boss really cares about my wellness. Your boss does not care about you. They're trying to lower their healthcare costs. Like, just, people know that. You just have to activate it, but we're working against like a giant propaganda system that's part of the media sphere, that's part of the entertainment sphere, and you have to be aware of that. And the whole educational institution is about punishing students, making them feel not good enough, making them feel like you have to be so special to be able to get that, scholarship to go to an Ivy League school. Like you can come out of Mount Vernon High School and be like, we have one student going to the Ivy League. Well, F that, every student is special. Right. Every human being is special. And we have to restore that idea of popular education. I really hate it that education now has been something that we parcel out only to the very, very, very top achievers. One of the amazing things about public education and high quality public education that I received in the public schools here was that it was for everyone. And, the teachers, the classrooms, it was really the best of the best, what I got. Yes, by the time I was at Mount Vernon High School, there were a lot of drug problems, there were other things, but when I was in that classroom, it was just incredible. And everyone had access to it, and now, but like through 40, 50 years of cutting and just like troubled housing, troubled jobs, you have this deterioration, and everyone's like, oh, what's wrong? Why aren't these kids getting better grades? You're not gonna get good grades if you're hungry, you're not gonna get good grades if you're worried about your parents losing their homes. There's just material things that have undermined African American achievement in this country that is like plain as day, and then they're like telling me like, oh, we've got these diversity fellowships. I'm like, that's BS. I know what we need. We need stable housing, universal health care. We all know that, but why didn't my class come out for it in 2016 and 2020 when we could have universal health care, when we could have had free public higher education? Because actually, you know what? Little snobby liberals don't want that. They want to have their, they want to monopolize education. Let me tell you a story here. Maybe my brother will be listening. My brother's very, very wealthy. His kids go to a very, very fancy pants private school in New York City. And they treat all of their students like artists and researchers. Every student should be treated like that. And it makes me so mad that your parents have to have $55,000 a year so that you can be treated like an artist and a researcher. Every human child should be treated like that. And that's what we should be fighting for.
Since no one else is taking the mic, I'm gonna definitely take one cue that you mentioned because, as an immigrant in Canada, I remember the 70s and as an African from the Caribbean in another colonial country, it didn't dawn on me, for all kind of different reasons, that this struggle still existed amongst working class and poor people and colonized people. But you're right in that it still pervades the immigrant working class here, even in the 21st century, in places like Mount Vernon. We have, and it's heartbreaking to me, and I've come through a lot of awakening. I'm blessed to be that kind of converted person, but it still hurts that many of my own Caribbean African peers in my generation or younger, we still have like a police state love for the colonizer, and we still see we have the same kind of colonial attitude toward people who are, other colonized people. And it's so disgusting in a place like Mount Vernon. I'm thinking, you should know better, we should know better, we should do better, because the more you know, the better we'll all do. But, I'm thinking, how you now, at one point, you got to fight the neo-colonial puppets and the colonizer, because that's, it's like now you're fighting family. So it's like a double trauma. It's bad enough you're in combat, but now you got to go home. You can't leave the front lines, because home is the front lines too.
Sorry, but that's
so
the way
how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that?
No. I guess like the one great thing that I did inherit from the 70s was like just generalized anti-authoritarianism. I hate authority. I respect knowledge, but I hate authority. And I want to teach that. I kind of teach that. Respect knowledge, hate authority. Even at home, especially at home. Because many of us come from very patriarchal formations. Yeah.
Brother, in your work on the way that the PMC hoards virtue, you cite the example from, I believe, Richard Tennett's, Sennett's well-known work, The Hidden Injuries of Class, and the kind of psychological, spiritual trauma that many members of the working class experience. And Brother Jeff also invoked the idea of trauma in trying to make sense of his own experiences as an immigrant arrival here in the city of Mount Vernon. And I know that this idea of trauma has also factored in some of your work and the lens that you use to make sense of it. And I wanted to know, firstly, it's increasingly popular to frame experience in terms of trauma, although it was a medical term. What made you attracted to this term, and how do you think it can really help us on a practical level to reframe a lot of our experiences and our interpretation of them in terms of trauma as opposed to other?
Well, to be perfectly frank, I feel like a lot of the liberal elites, mostly white liberal elites, want people of color to play a trauma drama for them. And the one thing that I think we should not do is allow ourselves to participate in this kind of sensationalization of trauma. The most important thing, I think, for us is to, for someone who has, experienced great suffering and rupture, and for someone who understands that, is within the public sphere, one of the most important things is to be able to reason, to be objective, but you need boundaries and empathy. I feel like a lot of times now in the sort of trauma culture that has developed, and I'm very critical of it, we allow for emotional flooding, which is like a technical term, like just allowing us to be overwhelmed by it so that we play this role, especially people are always talking about like intergenerational trauma in Asian Americans. Yes, Chinese people have been through a lot in the 20th century, but I don't want to play that role for white liberalism. We need to heal ourselves and heal our communities, but not play up to this expectation of the sensationalism of trauma. And I do have to say that I'm writing a book on a critique of trauma culture, and one of the people I really go after is actually Oprah Winfrey. Because she has made an industry of confessing, of highly sensationalized television confessions of suffering. In 1984, when she talked about her own childhood sexual abuse, it was electrifying television. But one of the things it did was differentiate her from the other daytime talk show hosts like Phil Donahue, who had a more old-fashioned, like more restrained attitude. And I feel like one of the things that now she keeps leveraging her brand, and she has this new Apple TV channel called The Me You Can't See, where Prince Harry and Lady Gaga and Glenn Close talk about their traumas. Now, I'm sure they've all suffered, but they're also multi-millionaires. And there's a kind of staging of their suffering so we can empathize with them, but most people who watch Oprah are not multi-millionaires, and the spectacle of trauma, I think, distracts from everyday ordinary struggles. And that's one of the ways in which I feel like trauma has been commodified and weaponized by PMC liberalism to actually suppress forms of solidarity and authentic empathy and healing that we need.
Hi.
Okay, that was a mouthful, but sorry.
I encountered you on John Early's Instagram, like, I don't know, a year and a
listened to it?
John Early's Instagram. And it was at a transitional time for me because I had been working at a lot of NGOs, and I was like losing my mind because I was feeling that something was very wrong, but I couldn't articulate what was happening. And I was like walking around New York City just like so angry when I found you on all these podcasts, and I was like, it was like this incredible like discovery, but it was also kind of maddening because it was like there was like 6 weeks of like, this is it. This is like an articulation of everything that I've been experiencing, and I'm starting to understand like how some of this identitarianism is actually like that I've participated in is really like completely contrary to the idea of any kind of solidarity and all this stuff that I purport to be on the side of. So that was very freeing, but then you start to just, once you understand it, you see it everywhere you look. And so now everyone I know is like, I know the PMC, I heard, like, they're so sick of me, like, trying to impart, you know, your ideas. So I kind of have two questions. One is, like, how do you, like, now I'm asking you to, like, be my therapist. Like, how do you, like, when you're seeing this everywhere, how do you not just get so angry all the time and just exist in the world? Yeah. And the other thing is, like, I talked to this about my father, who's a small business owner, and he's very much, like, his whole thing is about, like, making but when you talk about, like, emancipation for the largest number of people, like, that's his whole bag. But he's also, like, such a capitalist from a very, like, I guess, petty bourgeois framework. So when we talk about these things, we agree, but then I kind of am trying to explain to him that, like, the philosophy that he's subscribing to isn't matching with the values that he's ascribing, and then it gets then I'm moralizing about the PMC's moralizing, and I don't know, like, it's just, it feels very, like, one moment, like, so illuminating, and it's like, oh, this is the truth about everything, and then the next moment, like, just completely overwhelming and constraining. So, what's the answer?
Subscribe to my podcast, $39.95. Subscribe now. No, I don't have the answers, but I do feel like it's been like the air we breathe, and it's been poisoning us with regard to solidarity. And so being able to identify that there's this poison is step one. And then I also think, like, in the NGO world, that's a special situation because you've got to make a living. You've got to, you've got to pay the bills. So, and I know for a fact that if you start to question their solutions and their problems, they're vicious, the most vicious people, right? You lose your job. So there's, like, a practical matter of having to conform to this kind of demand that we're like, oh yeah, we're problem solvers, oh no problem. But, and that's alienation at work. And I think that understanding that and understanding the struggles of everyday people takes you to that next step where you just become like, how does this benefit ordinary people? How do I work for ordinary people? And the loneliness of that is capitalism at work. It atomizes us. We have no structures or organizations. Like, actually, I hate to say this, but, like, no, I don't hate to say this, but, the collective organizations like unions or even the party, like social parties, are so threatening to capital, right? That they're always being attacked. But I don't know if it's possible to unionize at work or do something. But one thing that I experience at my job right now is when I feel like really, really angry, I'm like, this is alienation at work. This reminds me that my interests are not aligned with the interests of the people here, and I have to try to do everything I can to create situations of solidarity, but I can't go up individually and fight every fight. You know what I mean? And we're in these situations where we're completely isolated, and you feel like you're like silent screaming all the time, but maybe that's a step one. And then step two is actually finding like spaces of solidarity, places of solidarity where authentic solidarity can take place. Because I think a lot of the NGO world is actually blocking that kind of real solidarity. There's just this weird solutionism, this weird smugness, and they're all trying to get grants from the donor class. There you go. They're all trying to be like, oh yeah, we have to make this so that the billionaire can give us more money. And just actually being aware of that is like step one to...
And when they do that, it's like in concert with their monopoly on like their personal righteousness, which is, so the hypocrisy of it is mind-blowing, but then when you start talking about class in this context is so verboten, like they just immediately shut it down. So yeah, it's an
It's really like the dilemma of our times. I mean, that rage, if rage can be the grounds for solidarity, you know, like you just think like, I'm like angry all the time. My son calls me a rage bro. I'm just a rage bro. He's right there. So I hear you. I see you. I mean, we need to hear each other and see each other. There's so few occasions for that. And it is like, it is a little bit like having higher expectations of authenticity with each other, of each other in public situations.
Thank you.
It's not a be all and end all. And buy my book for $29.
Are there other questions? Any other questions? Do I have questions, comments? There is much more to discuss in this book. Catherine, I have to tell you that some of the personages who appear in the book are, they're close friends of mine, but Stanley Aronowitz and Penny Lewis being two figures. Stanley was one of my mentors, and Penny was a fellow graduate school student. So there's a lot more we could unpack.
But we can keep it for another time, so then
Yes,
I can
but
come
we
back.
can keep it for another time.
And come back.
And we'll take Brother Abishai up on his offer. I'm a little concerned about the time because I am under the impression that the library is closing soon.
Yeah.
And that this might therefore be a good opportunity to bring our discussion to a close. But as I said, there is so much more that we could discuss, and I encourage everyone to get a copy of the book, to mine it, because you can read it. It's readable. It's not going to take you 20 hours to read this book. I've read it once and was rereading again today, and found it worth a second read. And so I encourage everyone to get a copy of your own. Again, everyone. Catherine, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. It is an immense pleasure. I can't tell you how important it is for the people of Mount Vernon to not only see the heights that we can all achieve at, but the commitment that we must have to one another, no matter where we may go, to give back to the community that gave so much to us, and we thank you for providing that example.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like I was made by Mount Vernon.